They found her wandering the forest barefoot, her skin carved with symbols that no doctor could identify. She spoke in perfect anatomical terms, but referred to herself only as the subject. In the bitter autumn of 1823, deep in the hickory woods of southeastern Ohio, a girl named Margaret Hayes re-emerged from the silence that should have buried her forever. She had been gone for 97 days, presumed dead, perhaps taken by wolves, or, as others whispered, by men who trafficked in darker rituals than any god would bless. What returned, however, was not the same Margaret. Her face bore the memory of her old innocence, but her eyes, those had seen something no living soul was meant to. She appeared to a hunting party near the banks of Hocking River Pale, naked, shivering and covered in symmetrical lacerations that had long since healed into scarified glyphs. She spoke softly at first, barely audible, until one of the hunters tried to comfort her. Then she sat upright and whispered, "The subject is prepared. Incision sites A through H are healed. The work may resume." That was the moment James Fletcher turned pale. He had fought in the War of 1812 and seen men as entrails on frozen soil, but nothing ever unstitched him like the calm certainty in that voice. Margaret had vanished from her father's cabin in July, leaving behind only her shoes, her diary, and a silence so heavy it warped the air. No blood, no note, no broken lock. Just gone. The town of Millfield searched for her, but in those days, forests weren't just trees. They were thresholds, boundaries between what could be known and what should never be discovered. When she did return, she brought the unknown with her. The first to examine her was Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a rational man trained in Philadelphia's finest medical colleges. He had treated her since she was a child. He remembered her handwriting, her fascination with medical texts, the questions she asked about anatomy and electricity. He also remembered her last visit, weeks before she vanished, when she inquired about galvanism and the conduction of pain through the spine. At first glance, Margaret appeared lucid. She responded to warmth, took water when offered, but she refused clothing. Every time they draped a coat over her body, she removed it with eerie precision, folding it before setting it aside. It wasn't shame or confusion. Something in her conditioning had unlearned the idea of modesty. But the true horror came when Dr. Hartwell observed her skin under lamplight. Her arms, torso, even the soles of her feet were patterned with deliberate cuts, now healed into raised silvery scars. They weren't random. Each line ran parallel to musculature, intersected at anatomical nodes, and formed complex sequences, almost mathematical in their precision. As he traced the scars on her forearm, Margaret spoke again. Entry 11. Stimulus applied via copper probes. Subject exhibited convulsions localized to the L3 nerve bundle. Pain response within expected threshold. Subject did not request cessation. Dr. Hartwell stepped back. She wasn't describing a memory. She was reliving a clinical report. Her pulse remained steady, her voice neutral. He asked gently, "Margaret, who did this to you?" She tilted her head, almost robotic. "The doctor. Session 3. The apparatus required calibration." It was then he realized she wasn't answering him. She was answering a phantom inquiry, one she had heard many times before. The repetition wasn't confusion. It was protocol. She had been trained to recite this. In a panic, Dr. Hartwell summoned two colleagues, Dr. Marcus Webb of Athens and Dr. Joseph Sterling of Lancaster. Both were skeptical, seasoned professionals with no patience for ghost stories. Yet, when they examined her, they refused to continue. Dr. Sterling vomited outside the clinic. Dr. Webb packed his instruments and left that same evening. None of them would speak about what they saw, but one fact united them. They would not treat her, not even for the simplest fever. Instead, they recommended immediate institutional isolation and for all notes to be destroyed. Hartwell refused. He wanted to understand. Margaret wasn't just a victim. She was a living archive of something that had no name in the annals of American medicine. So he kept her journal. Inside were cryptic entries dated the weeks before her disappearance. They began innocently enough: weather patterns, crop rotations, letters to her cousin. Then they turned darker. July 2nd. The doctor has asked me to observe the procedure tonight. He says my understanding is remarkable. July 5th. I was chosen. He said my curiosity was rare and that I could help advance medicine. I believe him. This is the work I was born for. July 12th. I consented. Pain is nothing compared to discovery. Hartwell's blood ran cold. She hadn't been taken. She had agreed, at least at first. Midway through her journal, the entries began to mimic the language Margaret now spoke aloud. The subject responds well to thermal variation. Incision at C2 yielded twitch response consistent with prior cadaver studies. Whoever the doctor was, he had overwritten her identity line by line, phrase by phrase, until all that remained was a living specimen. Hartwell knew he had to trace it back. He began to examine the few items recovered with Margaret. Her dress, torn and muddy, and a strange paper stitched into its hem. The ink was fine, the grammar clinical. Restraints must be secured before electrode placement. Session time not to exceed 30 minutes. Copper probes inserted at mapped nodes. Avoid proximity to spinal artery. This wasn't the scribble of a madman. It was the protocol of a highly trained medical mind. And Margaret? She wasn't his only patient. Hartwell couldn't sleep. The flicker of his oil lamp threw long shadows against his walls, and each time he blinked, he saw Margaret's vacant stare, the terrible calm when she recited her procedures like sacred scripture. Somewhere, a doctor had done this. Not a madman, but a scholar. A man of high breeding. One who had taken the Hippocratic Oath and twisted it until it screamed. Hartwell scoured his medical correspondences for clues. He remembered a letter he'd received months ago from a colleague, praising the brilliant isolation of pain response via direct nerve stimulation, citing results from a private lab west of Millfield. He dismissed it then. Now he knew better. Then came a revelation. Samuel Brennan, a settler who lived near the old Westfield farm, spoke of strange lights on the property late at night, weeks before Margaret's return. Always the same hour. Always the same window. I thought it were squatters, Brennan told him, but regular. Too regular. Same night. Same glow, like someone had a laboratory. Hartwell's hands shook as he unlocked his desk and removed Margaret's journal again. He compared the earliest entries to the final ones. Her penmanship, once flowing, became fragmented, jagged, like something was erasing her identity, letter by letter. They said I was special, that I'd been chosen. No one else understands, but I do. I see it now. The lines in the flesh, the current inside the blood. He says I am helping the future, that I am not Margaret anymore. Not Margaret anymore. Hartwell borrowed a lantern and a revolver and rode out to the Westfield property at dawn. The farmhouse had sat empty for years, its prior owner dead of fever. But now the weeds had been trimmed. The front door was recently oiled. Inside, dust clung to the walls, except for one back room. That space had been scrubbed, its floor clean. In the center sat a long wooden table with restraints at the neck, wrists, ankles. Leather straps stained with dried sweat and other fluids. Against one wall, copper probes, galvanic batteries. Surgical knives arranged by size, a primitive voltaic apparatus, and pinned above it all, diagrams of a woman's body, each labeled with incision points. The shapes carved into Margaret's skin matched exactly. He found a journal, thick, leather-bound, resting near a lamp. The entries were methodical, emotionless. Day 1. Subject M displays ideal physiology. Incisions initiated. Pain response within expected range. Day 16. Subject remains conscious. Commendable resilience. Nerve stimulations mapped and recorded. Day 32. Subject assists in positioning herself. Full cooperation achieved. Subject is transitioning. Transitioning. Into what? Hartwell flipped through the pages, bile rising in his throat. One line stood out. The patient now refers to herself as the subject. Identity unmoored. Progressing faster than expected. A photograph fell from the back of the journal. A sketch of a young woman, face blank, mouth slightly parted, Margaret. But then another. A young man, different scars, different notes. Subject A. James Patterson. A third. Subject C. Sarah Mills. There had been others. The doctor wasn't experimenting on Margaret alone. She was part of a series. Margaret was Subject G, the seventh. The entries grew darker. Subject E expired during neural incision. Must recalibrate voltage. Subject F developed vocal tremors. Requires sedative prior to session. Subject G shows unique adaptability. Potential candidate for full process. Hartwell dropped the journal, hands trembling. He had seen enough, but the worst was yet to come. The handwriting? It was familiar. Clean, disciplined, surgical. Hartwell opened his own medical notebook and compared the curves of the S, the tight coils of the R, the slashes of the T. His breath left his chest. He knew this handwriting. It belonged to Dr. Elias Cunningham, a respected physician in Athens. Harvard trained, a man Hartwell had consulted many times. A man known for his passion for neurology and his disdain for ethical constraints. It was Cunningham. It had to be. Hartwell's world collapsed inward. Cunningham had been to Millfield months before Margaret vanished. He had treated her father's back injury. He had brought books, had spoken to Margaret, encouraged her curiosity. He had groomed her. Hartwell stood in that terrible room, surrounded by torture cloaked in science. He imagined Cunningham leaning over Margaret with copper instruments, instructing her in the language of her own undoing. And Margaret, brilliant, isolated, eager to learn, saying yes. He locked the farmhouse behind him and returned to Millfield. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he made copies of the journal, wrote letters to the State Medical Board, the Attorney General, and several newspapers in Columbus. He sealed them in envelopes marked, "To be delivered if I do not return by the 15th. Then, and only then, did he ride to Athens. He knew what awaited, but he was no longer afraid. The curse wasn't Margaret's. It belonged to the man who made her forget she was ever human. If you've made it this far, you're not like other viewers. You're ready to see through the veil. Comment the phrase, "The subject remembers" twice below, and let the transformation begin. If this darkness moves you, if this truth unsettles something deep inside, like, share, and subscribe. We are just beginning to unveil the things they tried to bury. The carriage wheels ground to a halt in front of a brick house on Main Street, Athens, a building that stood with the authority of money and learning. Dr. Elias Cunningham's name gleamed from a brass plate beside the door, immaculate in serif letters. Inside that house, a man worshipped not God, but discovery, and the altar he built was made of flesh. Dr. Hartwell stood before the door, spine stiff, Margaret's journal under his coat, a sealed envelope pressed against his ribs like a talisman. The hinges groaned open, and a housemaid ushered him into the study, where he had once shared cordial conversations with Cunningham over tea and anatomy diagrams. Now the jars of floating organs looked like trophies. The door shut behind him. Cunningham rose from his desk, smile tight. His pale blue eyes scanned Hartwell's face, then drifted to the journal clutched in his hands. Not a flicker of surprise. "So," Cunningham said softly, "you found the lab." Hartwell laid the journal down on the desk without speaking. You always were the meticulous sort, Samuel, Cunningham continued, sliding into his chair as though this were a polite debate among scholars. I suppose you've come with questions. Hartwell's voice trembled with controlled rage. I've come for answers, and for names. Cunningham didn't hesitate. Subject G is Margaret Hayes. Subjects A through F were selected from remote settlements, drifters, orphans, and the quietly brilliant. All chosen carefully. He opened a leather portfolio and displayed sketches, 6 faces, male and female. Each bore the same etched scars Margaret carried. Beneath each face, only a letter, only a number. No names, no histories, just data. Hartwell felt bile climb his throat. You murdered them. Cunningham's eyes narrowed. I advanced medical knowledge, and I wasn't careless. I chose subjects who wouldn't be missed, and I documented everything, unlike the butchers in Philadelphia, who called their mistakes anomalies. I brought method. Hartwell's knuckles whitened around his coat. You stripped a woman's identity and carved her into a machine. She was willing at first, Cunningham replied calmly. She wanted to learn. I gave her purpose. You read the journal? She consented. Hartwell slammed the table. She was 22. Lonely. Curious. You exploited her mind and discarded her soul. Cunningham's veneer cracked. Don't be naive. Do you think any medical breakthrough was born of kindness? Do you think Jenner's cowpox tests were gentle? Do you think Franklin's experiments with electricity didn't cost pain? Someone always pays. But they pay in hope, Hartwell growled, not in chains. Cunningham rose slowly and walked to a glass cabinet. He opened a drawer and removed a surgical blade, gleaming, curved, familiar. You've brought evidence. I assume you plan to share it. With whom? Judges who owe me favors? Editors who fear lawsuits? Do you really think the truth survives in this country without permission? He stepped closer. They'll call her mad, Hartwell. They'll say she carved herself, that you imagined the rest. You'll lose your license. She'd be locked in an asylum. But Hartwell didn't flinch. Unless I don't return. Cunningham blinked. I made copies, Hartwell said, of the journal, the diagrams, your signature. They're already en route to Columbus, unless I stop them. Silence. Cunningham's fingers flexed around the scalpel. You're bluffing. Hartwell reached into his coat and pulled a second envelope, addressed in bold strokes. Governor's office. He let it rest on the table beside the journal. Are you willing to test that? Cunningham's breath caught, and then his expression shifted, not to fear, but to admiration. You do understand. Finally, his voice dropped to a whisper. This is what it means to step beyond morality, to sacrifice comfort for legacy. Hartwell stared at the man who had once taught him how to stitch a wound. Now that same man carved leaves open and left them hollow. Cunningham exhaled slowly. If you expose me, my work dies. But if you join me... Hartwell moved before the sentence finished. He drew the revolver from his coat and leveled it at the man's heart. You ended your work the day you touched Margaret. Cunningham didn't beg. Instead, he smiled faintly, like a priest going to martyrdom. You're just like me, he said. You're willing to do what's necessary. The shot echoed like a thunderclap through the study. Cunningham slumped backward, the scalpel clattering from his fingers. Blood pooled around the base of the mahogany desk, staining the floor where so many maps of skin had been drawn. Hartwell sat in silence, revolver in his lap, staring at the man's corpse. And then he moved quickly. He opened the cabinets, gathered every sketch, every note, every tool. Into a canvas sack they went, down to the river, into the flames. The apparatus was dismantled. The diagrams burned. He buried the knife in 3 feet of mud beneath the Hawking River Bridge. Cunningham's death was ruled a lab accident. No one questioned Hartwell's story. Why would they? He was the region's second most respected doctor. But the burden grew. He couldn't unsee Margaret's eyes, couldn't unhear her monotone voice reciting her own undoing, couldn't forget the others whose names were reduced to letters. So he retreated, sold his clinic, used the money to pay for Margaret's care with a reclusive Quaker household near Philadelphia. Trusted people, silent people. And Margaret? She never truly came back. She spoke, sometimes, helped in the kitchen, sat in the sun, but she never spoke of the forest, never used her own name. Only once did she look at Hartwell and say, in that same mechanical voice, "The procedure is complete, awaiting next assignment." That night, Hartwell wept, not for the monster he had destroyed, but for the girl who never got to choose what she became. The winter that followed Cunningham's death arrived early and cruel. Snow fell like ash across southeastern Ohio, blanketing the forests that had once swallowed Margaret Hayes and returned her as something else. Not a corpse, not quite a woman, but a living wound. Dr. Hartwell no longer practiced medicine in the conventional sense. His house remained dark most nights. He tended a few animals, grew root vegetables, but the tools of his trade, forceps, scalpels, probes, remained locked in a wooden chest beneath the floorboards. He could no longer look at them without remembering the diagrams burned into Margaret's skin. The townspeople thought him melancholy. Some said he'd lost faith in medicine. Others whispered he had seen something in those woods that broke his mind. They were right and wrong. Hartwell wasn't broken. He was haunted. Each month, he sent funds to the Quaker household that cared for Margaret. He visited her when the roads allowed, bringing books and fresh bread. She greeted him with a soft smile, sometimes. Other times, she would tilt her head and recite fragments of the protocols. Copper probe temperature, incision angles, restraint procedures, in that same chilling monotone. She was not insane. She was reprogrammed. What Cunningham had done to her wasn't just physical. He had rewired her perception of pain, identity, and obedience, reshaping her like wax under heat. Margaret had been brilliant once, perhaps even destined to become a physician in a world that did not yet permit it. Instead, she became his experiment. But Hartwell had not told the whole truth. There was one more journal, not Cunningham's, his own, hidden in the attic, wrapped in oilcloth. Its pages documented every detail: the autopsy-level scars, the lab in Westfield, the confrontation, the death. He wrote it not for posterity, but as penance. And in that journal, one chilling line was repeated 3 times. There were 7 subjects, but only one survived. No bodies had ever been found, no graves, just diagrams and notes, evidence that Hartwell had destroyed himself. But one memory returned to him each night. Margaret had spoken of other voices. "Subjects A and C spoke to me," she whispered once in her sleep. "They told me not to scream. They said the doctor doesn't like noise." He never asked her to explain. In his final years, Hartwell tried to calculate how far the damage had spread. Cunningham had contacts in Columbus, Cincinnati, even Boston. Letters, colleagues, students. Could there have been others? If Cunningham believed his work mattered, he would have shared it. And if someone had read those journals, someone who agreed with him, then the nightmare hadn't ended with a single death. It had only gone underground. Hartwell died in 1838, alone. The local pastor said he passed peacefully, but the housekeeper who found him claimed something else. She said the floorboards had been torn up in the study, that he had died clutching a faded sketch, Margaret's face expressionless, with the word "complete" written in the corner. The chest beneath the boards contained only 2 items: a scalpel wrapped in linen, and a lock of dark hair. The journal vanished, but stories persisted. In 1854, a farmhand outside Lancaster claimed he found strange instruments buried in a box near an abandoned well. In 1862, a Union soldier wrote in his diary about a makeshift field lab where a doctor experimented with pain resistance on wounded men before disappearing. And in 1901, a sealed file from Athens County was uncovered during courthouse renovations. Its contents were redacted, except for one name, Margaret Hayes. The file was resealed. The public was told it was of no relevance. But those who read the fragments, archivists, scholars, historians, began to wonder. If one doctor could do this in isolation, what might a network do? And then came the real question: what if they already had? In 1995, a graduate student named Evelyn Crane at Ohio University stumbled upon an anomaly while digitizing archival records. A handwritten report from 1823 referenced a series of invasive neural procedures conducted without formal oversight and made mention of female subject exhibiting induced dissociative behavior consistent with trauma from prolonged experimentation. Crane requested access to the full file. 3 days later, her request was denied. The documents were labeled medical history sealed by court order. But she didn't stop. She found the name Hartwell. She found Margaret. She even found a brief mention of Dr. Cunningham in an early issue of the Ohio Medical Gazette, praising his innovations in peripheral nerve response. No mention of his death. Crane filed a Freedom of Information Act request. The county clerk responded personally. "We advise against pursuing this matter further. The records are incomplete, and the content is considered psychologically harmful." Crane laughed it off until her academic advisor received an anonymous letter. Subject G was never the last. That advisor resigned 3 weeks later. No explanation. In 1996, Crane disappeared. Her car was found near Miller's Creek, the same area where Margaret Hayes had first been discovered, barefoot, decades earlier. The engine was cold, the driver's door was open, and on the passenger seat rested a single page from a leather-bound journal. Scrawled in red ink, the subject remembers. No one ever saw Evelyn Crane again. Margaret Hayes died in 1847, at age 46. Her grave bears only her name and 2 dates, no epitaph. But the caretakers of her final home described her final words as whispered calmly just before she closed her eyes. Session complete. Awaiting further instruction. No further words followed. No session came. Just the silence. And perhaps something watching. This was the curse of Margaret Hayes. Not that she suffered, but that she remembered. And that memory, that precise, clinical, bloodless memory, is the kind that survives. Not in hearts, but in hands. Hands that still hold scalpels. Hands that still probe the nervous system. Hands that still wear white coats and ask for silence. Final note from the narrator. If this story has unsettled you, good. Because what happened to Margaret was not fiction. It was a pattern. It's the quiet places, the sealed files, the forgotten oaths that birth the darkest truths. Not in haunted houses, but in well-lit clinics. Not in ancient ruins, but in laboratories behind brick walls. So if you ever hear the phrase, "the subject remembers," you'll know what came before, and what might still remain. Like, share, and subscribe if you made it to the end. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if Margaret showed up at your door, whispering those protocols? Until next time, stay brave. This was the Forgotten Rites.